30th of January 1933. On that day, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and before him, he found a deteriorated country, an unpayable debt, and a disarmed military. The Treaty of Versailles had turned the German giant into the laughingstock of Europe. We all know that history is written by the victors, and the Germans lost their military, political, and industrial power with the end of the First World War. Despite the idea that we may have of Germany as the great industrial power that could fight against the USA, France, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom all at the same time, the truth is that until the arrival of Hitler, it would not have even come close to achieving such a great struggle. To give you an idea, German industrial capacity was so weak that only 1.6% of Germans owned an automobile, compared to the English and French, who had 3 times as many, and a far cry from the 20% of Americans. But as you know, Hitler changed everything. Many have described the Nazi economy as the perfect war machine, a huge mechanism that involved the invasion of neighboring countries in order to liquefy their natural resources, forced labor camps resulting in the death of many of their prisoners, and private enterprises put at the service of one common goal, the Third Reich. Did Hitler succeed in developing a perfect war economy? If so, how did he do it? How did he convert German industry to arms production? What role did labor camps and private companies play? Today on Visualeconomik, we tell you all about it. History is full of individuals in the shadows, people that no one remembers, but who were nevertheless fundamental. Today's video begins with Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank, and one of Hitler's most trusted men. His role was crucial in the Führer's early years. He was one of the patrons who financed his presidential campaign, and later, with the Nazis already in power, he took the reins of the Ministry of Economy. Contrary to what it may seem, Schacht was not a radical. We're talking about a guy who was a defender of private property, business, and fiscal discipline. His moderate profile fitted Hitler's aspirations very well. Keep in mind that at that time, the power of government had not yet developed. The Nazis needed to win the admiration, the respect, and the support of the people. To this end, Schacht's Ministry of Economy dedicated its efforts to policies of public works, guaranteed employment, and market support. Schacht was opposed to arms development. He was a technocrat focused on economics. To give you an idea, while in its first years, the Third Reich spent more than 2 billion marks on roads, only 600 million marks went to the military sector. However, we all know that this vision did not last long. As time went on, one word gained more and more weight: Wirtschaft, the defense-centric economy, the idea that everything should revolve around securing Germany's military ambitions. From 1936 onwards, the government's priorities changed completely. On the one hand, the tentacles of the party had already spread throughout Germany. Its power was growing, and Hitler was able to do things he could not even dream of doing just 3 years earlier. Visualeconomik community, it was all set. It was just then that Germany began its turn toward the perfect war economy. The question is, who was behind it all? None other than Hermann Göring. Göring was Schacht's replacement in the economic ministry. He was a military man and future war criminal who commanded the air force of the Third Reich. Unlike Schacht, Göring had one fundamental objective: to prepare the country for war. The question is, how did he do it? Well, here we have to talk about his well-known 4-year plan, a roadmap that armed the country to the hilt. If the Nazis had to choose between producing butter for their people or weapons for battle, their choice was clear: weapons, weapons, and more weapons. Defense was the #1 priority. To illustrate this, in order to devote the available factories and materials to the production of armaments, automobile manufacturing was reduced by more than 85% in only 3 years. In fact, the Nazi Party went so far as to design a rationing card scheme to limit citizens' consumption and devote resources to the military sector.
Practically all other goods had become increasingly scarce in recent years, even before the outbreak of war. Whatever was available in terms of manpower, materials, and machines was to be invested in production of military economic importance according to an explicit order of the Führer.
Ordinary Germans could not spend what little money they had. It's not that they were cautious with their money, it's that the government didn't allow them to spend it. Proof of this is that bank deposits rose from 2 billion marks in 1938 to 12.4 billion marks in only 3 years. German bank accounts were overflowing because no one could spend their savings. And what do you think the Nazis did with that money? Indeed, forced the banks to lend it to keep producing more and more weapons. Of course, that was not all. One more essential ingredient in this war cocktail were the tax hikes. To put this in perspective, and even correcting for inflation, in 1943, the Germans gave 75% more of their income to the state than they did in 1938. Hitler went from spending 3% of GDP on the military sector to more than 50%. But if we take into account many indirect revenue streams, the total could have exceeded 80%. In other words, an entire economy dedicated to war. As you can imagine, no matter how much money the Nazis got, there was one thing they could not get easily: natural resources. Here, we're talking mostly about iron and coal. Can you imagine making weapons without steel? Well, unless they were going to war with slingshots, it was difficult. But there was a problem. Germany didn't have very good quality iron, nor did German companies seem very willing to follow the Führer's demands. The solution? The creation of the Reichswerke. The Reichswerke was basically a mega iron, steel, and coal conglomerate consisting of public and other private companies. Some entrepreneurs in the sector were delighted, as the government would invest a lot of money in them. Meanwhile, others believed that they would be forced to invest in unsustainable projects, that they would lose control of their businesses, or simply face unfair competition. But regardless of what the tycoons in the industry thought, the fact remains that Hermann Goering nationalized Germany's soil and turned the country into a gigantic iron ore mine.
The German soil will be drained of iron until the end.
But no matter how much they exploited Germany's iron ore, it wasn't enough. This is where the second pillar of Goering's economic policy came into play: autarky. But an autarky with a catch. Yes, Goering didn't want to hear about importing metal from other countries. After all, if you're going to start a war against the world, it's in your interest to be independent. But as the old saying says, if Muhammad won't go to the mountain must come to Muhammad. In other words, if foreign resources weren't coming into Germany, then Germany would go abroad. And so, in 1938, the Third Reich carried out the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. Shortly after, it was the turn of Czechoslovakia and of Poland. Well, what can I say? Of course, the annexation of foreign countries was not solely for economic reasons. We all know what Hitler thought of the famous living space of the Germans, but it certainly played a decisive role in the militarization of the Third Reich. As you can see in this graph, all the extra steel produced by the Nazis after 1938 came precisely from occupied countries. And don't think that we're only talking about steel. The occupied territories delivered 80% of the coal needed by German industry. For example, does Skoda ring a bell? The Czech automobile brand. The Nazi apparatus took control of companies like it and put them at the service of the war. In fact, Czechoslovakia was one of the key players in the iron and armament sectors. But don't be mistaken for thinking that this means that the occupied Europeans were the only ones to bear the cost of German rearmament. Not at all. Germans not only supported the war with their savings, invasions, and taxes, but also with their labor. By the end of the conflict, more than 60% of Germans worked directly or indirectly in the military sector. Some of these workers simply left their jobs and went to some arms factory, but others converted their workspaces to focus on the military sector. Incidentally, this is something we have also seen recently in Ukraine, with cases such as mattress companies now turning to manufacturing military uniforms. Well, the same thing happened with the Nazis. For example, the alcoholic beverage industry increased its workforce by 25%. And no, this has nothing to do with German brewing fame, but with the fact that these factories were adapted to produce organic fuels. But take note, because when we talk about workers, we speak inclusively. The presence of women in industry skyrocketed, and so female labor participation in 1941 reached 51%, much higher than the 40% or 35% of the United Kingdom or the USA. But speaking of labor, now we have to talk about the worst aspect of the Nazi economic machine. Hitler didn't hesitate to put Jews and prisoners of war to work. It is estimated that at the peak of the war in 1944, the number of prisoners in forced labor exceeded 7.5 million. We are basically talking about slaves. Slaves who accounted for as much as 1/5 of the entire labor force in Germany. The French prisoners of war were sent to work in agriculture. The Soviets were sent to work in industry, while the Jews were sent to work in... We've all seen the kind of work the Nazis subjected them to in the concentration camps. In the forced labor mechanism, private companies also played a fundamental role. Many prisoners from camps like Auschwitz were sent to factories, to construction companies, to mines. Basically, the Nazi government rented prisoners as slaves, and the private companies paid a price for which, of course, the prisoner did not receive a penny. But do you know what? The irony is that despite everything, despite the fiscal subjugation of citizens, the annexation of other countries, and the exploitation of prisoners, Germany failed miserably to rearm. The 4-year plan was a failure. That's what I said. It didn't meet any of its production targets. In fact, if Germany managed to dominate Europe, it was not because of its superior weaponry or productivity. Despite the huge increase in spending, overall the growth of military production after 1936 remained stagnant. Of the 270,000 tons of steel that the plan allocated to the armed forces each month, only 195,000 tons were actually received. The armament production scheduled for 1939 was not fulfilled until 1942. And the completion of the fortifications was not completed until 1948. That is, 3 years after the end of the war. To give you an idea, when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, he only had 300 tanks of the latest model, and of the 15,500 fighter planes scheduled, only 11% had been manufactured. In other words, the preparation for the war was a disaster. But why did the initial forecasts fail so badly? Well, it's largely due to two constraints of all dictatorships: that everyone lies and no one wants to contradict the leader. From 1936 on, no relevant change in steel quotas, which, let's not forget, was the most important material, was approved without the explicit consent of the Führer. And what can I say? Hitler was as good at economics and accounting as he was at painting. The production targets he proposed were crazy, but of course no one dared to contradict him. Well, actually, that's not the truth. Do you remember Hjalmar Schacht? When Hitler wanted to start his war economy, Schacht was strongly opposed. He considered Goering to be utterly incompetent. And in fact, it later became known that during the war, Schacht was part of the resistance against Hitler. The outcome? He was eventually dismissed as a minister, lost his position at the Reichsbank, and in 1944, he was sent to the Dachau concentration camp. Visualeconomik community, Hitler had many mutually incompatible goals. The most striking one was to boost both the production of tanks for the war and vehicles for the German people. In other words, produce more cars and more tanks at the same time. The problem? That both use similar materials and labor. In short, scarce resources that could go to either cars or military vehicles, but not both as Hitler intended. In the end, many production lines had to be cancelled, but that wasn't all. As the market had virtually disappeared, factories lost a way to coordinate. Many factories ended up with huge quantities of iron that they couldn't convert into steel for lack of coal, for example. And they couldn't buy coal either because it was controlled by the government. German planning was proving to be a disaster, and it was in this context, from 1939 onwards, that the man known as the father of the German armaments miracle, Albert Speer, came to the fore. According to the most popular version of the story, Speer was a kind of apolitical technocrat obsessed with improving industrial production, doing more with less. Hitler gave Speer powers that went far beyond those of Goering, and he did indeed use them. To begin with, he centralized a large number of the production decisions that had previously depended on very diverse bureaucracies. In other words, he closed the less productive factories in order to dedicate those resources to large companies that would take advantage of the economy of scale and could follow a single directive. To give you an idea, Speer reduced the number of military factories from 900 to 36 in only 4 years. But he also homogenized production. That is, he made the way of producing depend on similar machinery in all places. Do you want a specific case? For example, the number of dam types, both mechanical and hydraulic, was reduced from 440 to 36. The number of truck models from 151 to 23. In other words, Speer brought the Henry Ford model to the German military industry. So what was the result? Production of M109 fighters soared from 180 to more than 1,000 per month, and the number of man-hours required to build a Panzer was cut in half. Production in both the arms and consumer industries soared. Or at least, this is the most widespread version of the story. But is it true? Well, no. Sorry to ruin so many documentaries about World War II with tank montages and Wagner soundtracks, but there was no armament miracle. And let's see, don't get me wrong, production did grow. The data are true, but in this case, we are talking about terribly distorted data. For example, double. These figures were achieved at the cost of sacrificing even more other sectors that did not appear in the statistics. If ammunition production soared, it was not because German factories had suddenly become more productive, but because much more steel was allocated to it, at the expense of other sectors, and largely thanks to the successes of resource theft from other countries. In any case, the less part of doing more with less never happened. Yes, metal waste was cut in the odd process, but the number of workers producing tanks was also increased by 60%. But that's not all. The increase in production was also paid for by sacrificing quality. A very clear example is the M109 fighter planes, which we have spoken about before. Production soared, but by 1943, these machines were more like winged coffins than airplanes. When they were first tested during the Spanish Civil War, they were the top of the line. But the Nazis, bent on producing more and more, neglected research into innovation. In order to produce high volumes, they had to simplify production and put all their eggs in the same basket, and the result was a disaster. To give you an idea of how clumsy they were, even the Gustav, the most advanced models, took 4 seconds to turn 45 degrees, despite being able to fly at 500 kilometers per hour. And as if this were not enough, from 1943, when it seems that the German economy was indeed becoming more productive, the Allied bombing raids forced Nazi industry to disperse again. If there is so much talk about the armament miracle, it is pure propaganda. Think about it. The first years of the Second World War were not bad for Germany, in spite of everything. The conquest of France, the naval superiority of the U-boats, the success of Rommel and the Japanese allies. Hitler could sell the idea to his people that the war was winnable. However, the economy was running out of steam, and people were beginning to notice. In this context, doing more with less was the perfect slogan to further mobilize the Germans. In conclusion, Hitler pulled out all the stops to turn Germany into a war machine. But despite the huge mobilization, the conquered territories, and the famous German efficiency, the country did not stand a chance against the UK, the US, and the Soviet Union. It was far from being the perfect war economy. Hitler financed the war by plundering his population, enslaving 7 million people, stealing natural resources, and sacrificing quantity for quality. But at this point, it's your turn. What did you think of the German rearmament miracle? Do you think Hitler rushed into Poland when he was unprepared? What should he have done to rival the Allied armed forces? You can leave me your answers in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.